welcome to Money Trail with me, Amir Arafat. Today, money, corporate media, and concentration of media ownership in the U.S.
It seems to be quite corporatized. I would imagine it's mostly governed, I'd say, by the corporate entities, about the money flow going into them, and their opinions are based on the finances that make them happen.
And you have to see, who are running these networks.
They just tell the people what they want to hear, but I don't think they tell the people the truth.
I think it's controlled by a few different people, and a few of the same people.
Just a few days ago, I tried to do research on an unbiased news media outlet, and frankly, it's just populated with say the 5 or 6 big names that exist.
I think they're corporate. I mean, they're owned by mainstream media is private interests and is owned, by a few people. And again, if it's owned by just a few people, they have enough resources. They're going to be able to have news that kind of support their interests.
Back in 1983, approximately 50 corporations controlled the vast majority of all news media in the United States. Today, ownership of the news media has been concentrated in the hands of just 6 incredibly powerful media corporations. These corporate behemoths control most of what we watch, hear, and read every single day. They own television networks, cable channels, movie studios, newspapers, magazines, publishing houses, music labels, and even many of our favorite websites.
It's clear that there are just a handful of companies that now dominate the media. 15, 20 years ago, there were 50. Now it's down to 6 or 7. And many new companies, new players like Google, for example, online companies, Yahoo and the others, are also becoming major forces because more and more people don't rely on broadcast media. They're relying on online media. So you have a multiplicity of sources, but you still have concentrated ownership.
Increasingly, we have fewer and fewer larger corporations controlling the media in the United States, at least the media that most people see, the major television networks, in some cases the newspapers. And so this is not a good development where you have fewer and fewer interests controlling what more and more people see.
The 6 corporations that collectively control U.S. media today are Time Warner, Walt Disney, Viacom, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, CBS Corporation, and NBC Universal. Together, the Big 6 absolutely dominate news and entertainment in the United States. But even those areas of media that the Big 6 do not completely control are becoming increasingly concentrated. For example, Clear Channel now owns over 1,000 radio stations across the United States. Companies like Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft are increasingly dominating the internet. But it is the Big 6 that are the biggest concerns. When you control what Americans watch, hear, and read, you gain a great deal of control over what they think. They don't call it programming for nothing.
What we've seen over the years is that, one company can dominate many broadcast outlets. Comcast has bought NBC, so they own all not only the NBC broadcast outlets, but the television company Universal is owned by Comcast now. In terms of Disney, they own a whole bunch of cable stations, some of them extremely popular, particularly with young people, but they also own ABC News, some magazines, and the like. You have the same thing with CBS as part of the Viacom family, as they call themselves, with Viacom owning MTV as well as CBS News. There are organizational differences and structures of how it's managed, but it's still owned and controlled by one corporation. Sumner Redstone is the big boss of Viacom. And this goes on, across the spectrum.
Back in 1983, it was bad enough that about 50 corporations dominated U.S. media. But since that time, power over the media has rapidly become concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. In 1983, 50 corporations dominated most of every mass medium, and the biggest media merger in history was a $340 million deal. In 1987, the 50 companies had shrunk to 29. In 1990, the 29 had shrunk to 23. In In 1997, the biggest firms numbered 10 and involved the $19 billion Disney-ABC deal, at a time the biggest media merger ever. In 2000, AOL Time Warner's $350 billion merged corporation was more than 1,000 times larger than the biggest deal of 1983.
We only have a few corporations here in the United States that control most of the media. We have Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, which runs Fox News, but also they own the Wall Street Journal. They own a lot of foreign newspapers, the Times of London, and several Australian newspapers. And what we get from the Murdoch empire is nothing but neoconservative propaganda, 24/7, whether it's over the television or over their internet sites or over the radio stations they own, or through their newspapers. Let's look at Time Warner and CNN. Here again, we have what used to be a decent network, CNN. Ted Turner doesn't have any control over it anymore. He told me that a couple years ago in New York. It's an infotainment channel now.
These gigantic media corporations do not exist to objectively tell the truth to the American people. Rather, their primary purpose of their existence is to make money.
What you have to understand is that the media in the United States and elsewhere is an economic entity. These are businesses, and they want to make money. And the way you make money is to build a bigger and bigger audience, especially for these large corporations on networks and so forth.
These gigantic media corporations are not going to do anything to threaten their relationships with the biggest advertisers, such as the largest pharmaceutical companies that literally spend billions in advertising. And one way or another, these gigantic media corporations are always going to express the ideological viewpoints of their owners.
What we're seeing with the broadcast networks is what used to be 22 minutes, if you add in commercials, of hard news. Now it's there's sports, there's Hollywood stories, and there's very little hard news. And then there's this other news people can use, and it's usually about some new drug and how it can help. And we know that these are being placed by public relations companies acting on behalf of pharmaceutical companies, because they know that the demographic that watches the broadcast news are mainly retired elderly people. So obviously you're trying to sell them the newest pharmaceuticals.
What often happens here, what always happens here, is not that there's a totalitarian state, that is not the experience of the United States, that tells the media what to report. It's very often a sort of collective self-censorship where we view the world in a certain way, in a majority way, and reflect reality based on that particular point of view.
Prior to 1927, public airwaves in the United States were regulated by the United States Department of Commerce and largely litigated in the courts as a growing number of stations fought for space in the burgeoning industry. The Federal Radio Act of 1927, signed into law on February 23, 2027, nationalized the airwaves and formed the Federal Radio Commission, later named the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, to assume control of the airwaves. The Communications Act of 1934 was a stepping stone for all the communications rules that are in place today. When first enacted, it created the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 was an influential act for media cross-ownership. The legislation, touted as a step that would foster competition, actually resulted in the subsequent mergers of several large companies, a trend which still continues. Over 4,000 radio stations were bought out, and minority ownership of TV stations dropped to its lowest point since the federal government began tracking such data back in 1990. Since the Telecommunications Act of 1996, restrictions on media merging have decreased.
The deregulation of the major media do more than anything else to increase the concentration of power into fewer and fewer hands. And so, from the perspective of many people, that is not a good situation. The people who want this are the very wealthy, the corporations themselves who have the money to buy up more groups of television stations, more media outlets, and this is fewer and fewer people buying more and more of the assets out there that are broadcasting. That's who wants this, the absolute wealthy.
Sadly, most Americans do not even stop to think about it. Who's feeding them the endless hours of news and entertainment that they constantly ingest? The average American watches 153 hours of television a month. In fact, most Americans begin to feel physically uncomfortable if they go too long without watching or listening to something.
When you ask people what they learned from watching, television programming, they can't remember really what they've seen. It's hard for them to know what's important and what isn't important. And that's the whole kind of entertainment orientation of news.
Sadly, most Americans have become absolutely addicted to news and entertainment, and the ownership of all that news and entertainment that we crave is being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands each year. But do the American people trust the mainstream media?
No. No, I don't. I feel that there's too much of a corporate ownership of all media outlets. When you follow the trail of ownership, it probably boils down to about 6 different people.
No, not necessarily trust. I think much of it needs to be interpreted. Reading between the lines is probably more often than not, because they all are paid by somebody, and their opinions are probably based with some influence from the monies that pay their checks.
Oh, the media? Nah, not really. I think they just be lying about different things and like doing their job or whatever.
I don't think you get the whole story. I just don't.
Their motto, their slogan is, fair and balanced, and everybody, is tongue-in-cheek because everybody knows that they have a viewpoint that they tend to support.
Fortunately, an increasing number of Americans are starting to wake up and are realizing that mainstream media should not be trusted. According to a new poll just released by Gallup, the number of Americans that have little or no trust in the mainstream media is at an all-time high. That is one reason why we have seen the alternative media experience such a rapid growth over the past few years. The mainstream media has been losing credibility at a staggering rate, and Americans are starting to look elsewhere for the truth about what is really going on.
I definitely see a significant shift in the United States away from the mainstream media and toward alternative sites.
Do you think that anyone in the mainstream news would actually tell you that the Federal Reserve is bad for America, or that we're facing a horrific derivatives bubble that could destroy the entire world financial system? Do you think that anyone in the mainstream media would actually tell you the truth about deindustrialization of America, or the truth about the voracious greed of Goldman Sachs? Sure, there are a few courageous reporters in the mainstream media that manage to slip a few stories past their corporate bosses from time to time. But in general, there's a very clear understanding that there's simply certain things that you just do not say in the mainstream media.
See, the 24/7 news channels, they have to fill up all that time with a lot of blather. And they have people on who, many of them aren't even journalists. They're political hacks, pundits, pollsters. They used to work for members of Congress. And they get on the air and they make these statements some people say, and they put out rumors. This isn't news. These are unsubstantiated rumors that are being put out. And Fox is, of course, the most notorious, where they'll have somebody say, some people say that, and then they'll come out with some opinion or unbased rumor. And unfortunately, that's we're seeing that a lot more with these networks. They've got to fill up the time, and what suffers is the real news. It's really nothing more than a talk fest. When you look at these network news shows, these cable network news shows, you don't see much in the way of any hard news. Even the broadcast networks, the ABC, NBC, and CBS, and there's some talk that their evening news broadcasts may disappear in the next couple of years because of the competition from the cable networks.
But are there any rail lines in this free world of mainstream media? this free flow of information, knowledge, and news.
I call it the third rail. If anyone is familiar with the subway, you know if you hit the third rail, you're gone, you're electrocuted. And any criticism of Israel, look, I've had colleagues in Washington who have paid that penalty. Helen Thomas, the long-serving correspondent in the White House, first with UPI, then with Hearst Newspapers. She was basically grabbed after a White House news conference by somebody with a hidden camera, and she didn't know she was on the air, and gave her personal opinion. Well, she lost her job and her credentials at the White House as a result of that. But you know, we had Rick Sanchez at CNN, and many others have made comments, and the minute those comments are made, their careers are basically over with. So yeah, any criticism of Israel is just not as far as the media is concerned. There's watchdog groups. One called the Committee for Accuracy in Mideast Reporting in America, CAMERA. Another one called MEMRI, Middle East Reporting Service. I forget the actual name, but MEMRI and CAMERA are two that monitor what's said on the airwaves and over the television networks and over the print media. And the minute they see any criticism of Israel, editors and publishers and owners are called, and there's a severe penalty to be paid. And that penalty usually is to fire the journalists who either made the comment or wrote something, or even if it was in a personal way. Octavian Nasser with CNN tweeted something about Sheikh Fadlallah in Lebanon, and she lost her job over that. Yeah, it's a very big issue here. The control that the Israel lobby has over the media. They say it's, of course, they defend themselves and say it's a conspiracy theory to talk about it. But I've seen a lot of victims of that conspiracy theory myself. And Washington, D.C. alone has a lot of unemployed journalists as a result of their so-called conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I think our coverage throughout in the United States has given the Palestinians and the plight of the Palestinians short shrift. I think it has obviously emphasized the values and interests of Israel and the stability of Israel. I think there are some reasons for that. I think there obviously are some historic reasons. There are also some economic reasons. And here at home with Christian conservatives, these are not Jewish moderates. These are Christian conservatives who hold a very strong feeling in their heart for Israel. You have a political dynamic in which you see news stories, or in the case of the Gaza 2008 attacks, you saw news stories here that really reflected, by and large, Israel's point of view.
Thanks to all the truth coming from the mainstream media. Over the past few decades, there has been a dramatic shift away from the corporate media toward more alternative sources of information.
I think the American people themselves don't have a lot of love for this 1% of the financial interests, those people who really disproportionately own a share of the media outlets. On the other hand, I think the American people did hear a lot about the Occupy Wall Street movement. I think what they saw very often was a movement for the 99% that reflected itself in unfavorable ways. The people looked like they needed a haircut. The people looked as if they might not be hard workers. And so the point of the Occupy Wall Street movement, I think, was skewed somewhat in the media.
How about war? What is it the mainstream media or corporate media tell the American people, or for that matter the entire world, about U.S. military adventures?
Well, it's almost like made for Hollywood movies. When we saw the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan followed by the intervention in Iraq, these cable news networks would start their news broadcast with this Hollywood-type military music, sort of action move, the kind of theme music you would hear in an action film. And they would all fly the American flag as a graphic in the background.
Remember, in the United States during Iraq, there was a rule for years that we back here in the United States could not photograph the coffins, the flag-draped coffins of the United States military soldiers who were coming back here. The government understood that in order to photograph the cost of this war in very visual terms, that it would hurt the government interest in pursuing the war in Iraq.
First of all, they didn't even know where Iraq is, or what Iraq is, or what happened to people in Iraq, because it really wasn't about Iraq. It took place in Iraq. Okay, the war took place there, but the real story for the American viewer was the role of the American troops and what they have done, our heroes, so to speak. So there was an effort to sell the war, not really reveal much about it.
One of the things that happened in the Iraq War, as an example of the way the United States media approaches a large global event, is that it saw the war in terms early on that the administration, the Bush administration, said was true. Therefore, this was a war on behalf of liberty. And it de-emphasized the idea that we were trying to stabilize an area for the oil, which I think in retrospect was very much a part of the equation, and people understand that.
Well, it's almost like made for Hollywood movies. When we saw the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan followed by the intervention in Iraq, these cable news networks would start their news broadcasts with this Hollywood-type military music, sort of action the kind of theme music you would hear in an action film. And they would all fly the American flag as a graphic in the background.
We don't see it in Afghanistan in a detailed way when a bomber from the United States or a missile goes in and destroys what our leaders say is a leadership mode, a place where leaders and terrorists are operating, when in fact it might actually have been something that damages, destroys, and kills civilians.
We saw embedded journalists with these military units basically acting as PR representatives for the Pentagon. When we go back to Vietnam, and we saw a lot of independent journalists in Vietnam, and how they reported the news had a big impact on the American public's attitude towards the Vietnam War, and therefore there was a lot of opposition to the Vietnam War. But the military recognized that was a problem, and now they want to embed journalists with these military units so you don't see the blood and the guts and the gore that we saw in our living rooms in the 1960s out of Vietnam. They want it to be a clean strike type war. They want everything to be electronic in nature. They don't want people to see the absolute human tragedies and the killing and the murders that takes place with these high-tech wars. They want everybody to concentrate on the military briefings and the electronics and the gadgetry and the graphics.
Well, thank you for watching. Always follow the money trail with me, Amir Harfa.